Welcome to another episode of the Nuances Podcast, where we go beyond first impressions with the Asian diaspora and explore our often complicated relationships with our cultures and how they affect everything from our career choices to our views on anti-racism, disability justice, climate justice, religion, feminism, LGBTQ rights, and more. I'm your host Lazu, a new American who grew up in the only place the dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. Today we have our first guest from the Lao diaspora. Laos is a country in Southeast Asia bordered by Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and China. Most Americans learn a little bit about the Vietnam War at school, but fewer learn about that secret war that was being fought alongside it. From 1964 to 1973, the US dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. More bombs were dropped on Laos during the war in Vietnam than on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. It made Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. This was a covert CIA operation in an effort to destroy communist supply lines between Laos and Vietnam. The secret war in Laos eventually came to light through a 1971 congressional hearing, but its sheer scale and devastation remain invisible to much of the American public. If you recall, in Season 3, Episode 3, Dr. Manoj Moradian talked about how the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran was a model that was replicated in other places. Well, this was one of those similar operations, except this time the US didn't win that one. If you haven't heard that episode with Manoj, you should totally go listen to that after this one. I promise you it's worth it. Not many terms to define today. The only thing I have is pho, P-H-O. It's a soup dish consisting of broth, rice noodles, herbs, and meat. As always, definitions and all related links will be in the show notes at nuancespod.com. Now on to our conversation with Rita Phetmixay. Our guest today is Rita Phetmixay. Rita is a second-generation Lao Isaan American holistic mental health and wellness professional based in Los Angeles. She's also the creator and host of the Healing Out Lao'd podcast, which explores the intersection of the Lao diaspora, storytelling, healing, and tools for sustainability. Rita, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You had a short film titled Phetmixay Means Fighter. So tell us about your name and your relationship to it.
Yes, and Phetmixay means fighter. I created a short documentary film that highlights the nuance and the energy that my family brought to the United States. And so my dad was a rebel in the secret civil war in Laos. He actually had to create an alias and change his name because the Communist regime party was looking to kill him. My dad's a fighter. It really resembled just being able to overcome all odds, being resilient. I think that translated in the energy that he had when he was raising all of us kids, children of refugees in a foreign country. And for me, my relationship with my last name goes back to war times and being able to really fight through and find some level of liberation, freedom, to be able to be your authentic self. The Lao people, we've always had to fight for resources, fight for representation. And so for me, this is a lifelong journey of being able to embody that energy of resilience, of fighting, again, resting as well. So part of what I fight for is rest. So that's really what it represents for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know about the fact that your dad changed his name. So that's the name that he adopted.
Yeah, Pet means diamond and Misai means a winner, somebody who overcomes all odds. And so diamond, you think about what it represents, diamond in the rough, that phrase. And no matter how hard you hit it, you can't really change the composition of it. It's just really hard. And so I think it's the same dynamic that my dad saw in himself. I'm going to win this war. Even if I go to another country and start a new life, I'm still a winner in myself and how much effort I've put in my family and how I've cultivated and raised my children to be the best of the best.
Yeah. For many of us here, even though we're all under the API umbrella, we don't know much about Lao history or Lao culture. Do you want to go a little bit more into Lao history and how your family ended up moving to the US through Thailand?
Yes. I just want to preface that even a lot of Lao kids in the diaspora don't even know a lot about their history and culture just by virtue of intergenerational trauma that has taken place and refugee parents who are really sensitive sensitive to reliving those traumatic memories of escapism, being displaced and whatnot. So I had the privilege of learning my history through my dad's lens. He's a storyteller and he wanted to make sure that we knew our history. So Laos is the country, about 7 million people. I'm pretty sure the population has grown since the data on Wikipedia. But yeah, there was a secret civil war that took place in Laos, and Laos was almost looped into the communist regime. So if you hear about the Vietnam War, it's a misnomer because there's other countries that were involved, not just Vietnam. And so Laos was a proxy nation state that was involved. And at that time, around like 75, the fall of Saigon and the communist regime taking over. Before that, it was Royal Lao. So there's like three kingdoms that evolved over time, three monarchies. I don't know the specifics, but I know that it was a clash of political ideologies that happened between the communist influence and then the royal monarchies. And then my dad was part of the royal monarchy side and trying to preserve freedom for his country. And he was involved in war and combat. And there was a huge displacement during that time. The US involved themselves. And that's why a lot of people don't know about Laos because there's a secrecy happening. Laos is actually the most bombed country per capita. And of course, that's based off of some old data. Maybe like the US is doing this right now to some other country, who knows? But at that time, it was about 9 years, maybe 64 up until 75. There was just a long period of bombing from the US side to stop communism from infiltrating more of Laos and to preserve capitalism, for example. And so that's more like the political view of Laos. But a lot of folks, then like hundreds of thousands of people were displaced because of that war. And the United States wanted to take responsibility of, okay, if we lose this war, then we're going to receive your people who were part of the rural side. And then there's a huge displacement all over the world. So not only in the US, but in Canada, in France, in Australia, some in Germany, some in New Zealand. We're all displaced all over the world. But, think about the cultural side, a very sabai. Sabai is like a phrase that means like relax and really chill. 97% of population practices Theravada, Buddhism. So really chill folks in general. And a lot of folks don't know, again, because of that secrecy for that long amount of time. And there's so many other types of tribes. So my tribe is the lowland Lao tribe. Then, hear of the Khmer folks, Hmong folks, over 160 different ethnic groups from Laos as well. So it's hard to really clump into one particular type of identity or experiences when there's so many different ethnic tribes. So yeah, that's, Lao history from my point of view in a nutshell.
Yeah. In another interview, when you were talking about your film, you said that it was important for you to document and remember that history. Why was it important for you?
It's important because if not now, then when? I suffered a lot from just not knowing. There was a lot of grief, not seeing yourself on TV. Granted, I had the privilege of learning about my history from my dad, but I imagine other refugee children who don't see themselves, don't hear these stories, and are constantly experiencing some level of violence or abuse or trauma, whether that's with poverty, institutional racism, domestic violence in the household. But I wanted to give a different perspective. We are strong people. We have come from a path of resilience, and we don't have to stop here and shrink ourselves and make ourselves smaller. So I knew I had to do something with my dad's story. And when I got to UCLA, I was a grad student in the Asian American Studies program. And I was met with, opportunity to create a short documentary film. And I took advantage of that because I can't let this opportunity go to waste. And I want to see more of my people on the screen. And I didn't realize I had that talent to be able to translate my dad's story into a film. That's where it hits home. That representation is actually really powerful for our community that has been kept under the rug for so long.
Yeah. I also don't know much about my own family's history. They escaped China. The only thing I know is that my great-grandfather disguised into a woman to get on a boat because he didn't want to fight in that war. And they took a boat and went to Mauritius, which is where I grew up. But I don't know much of anything else.
What? Oh my gosh, that is wild. I loved hearing about that history because I don't even hear about that too, that, Chinese migration, and we don't hear about that.
So when you talk about never seeing yourself represented, I can totally relate to that because as a Chinese Mauritian, which is a tiny African island, I never see representation. So, yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah, we have to put our people on the map. Come on, we exist. Because that's the thing, is that when we don't see ourselves, it's almost as if we have to live under a rock, like we don't exist. And that could be so painful to not know that, oh, there's somebody else that relates or understands, or even like y'all are real. Because I also was isolated. I didn't grow up with a Lao community. I grew up in a predominantly white community back in North Carolina. We would go to the temple, but again, a lot of other Lao families were spread out all over, and we live in the rural side. So it was like, okay, I don't get how we came here still. So who are these other Lao people? And yeah, it's so important to build community and to recognize that, oh, we are real. We're not just existing in this delusion.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's only now in my mid 30s that I'm starting to realize how much I believed that my voice didn't matter for a very long time. And it's only now that I'm starting to realize, hey, you know what? It should. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's not you, then who?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we can't wait for someone else to say, oh, your voice matters. No, you already were born, and just by virtue of being here and existing, your voice already matters.
Right.
So that's something I've had to learn and relearn. My dad, he's been such an influential person in my life that he made us almost realize, hey, like like Lao people, Lao history, you're going to learn today. So I would say I have that privilege, and it just pains me that my fellow Lao diaspora children refugees don't have that experience that I did. So I try my best to make sure that they know that they are worthy, they are seen, they're validated. And just because we're not seeing each other in the mainstream, that we can create that in our own platforms. Because again, social media is such a huge tool today to create massive movements and ideas and promoting different narratives. We've grown a lot since I have been raised, and it just makes me humbled that my generation, millennials, have now created a path for Gen Z to be able to highlight and to know that, yeah, it's okay. It's normal to be Lao, that just because someone doesn't understand doesn't mean it's invalidated.
Yeah. We talk about Lao not being represented and people just not knowing. So, what are some of your favorite things about Lao culture that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes, I love our food.
I've never had Lao food, so I'm very curious.
Yeah, your mind's gonna be blown. Your taste buds are gonna be rocketing. It's so good. And that's something I knew I was gonna miss as soon as I graduated home. There's a point in my life where I dealt with body image issues. And I had this memory come up for me. I'm like, oh my God, there's one point when, trigger warning, but I stopped eating a little bit just because I had issues of being a little bigger in my eyes than the white skinny girls at my school. And then I realized, why would I do that if I'm growing up with such enriching foods? I'm depriving myself of my own people, my own foods. And so I think for me, like that was a huge turning point where I had to recognize I'm okay as I am. Our foods are so enriching, so fresh. I don't know if you ever tried LAB, Laab or P, but it's minced meat salad. It's made with fresh herbs, toasted rice, fish sauce, lime. That's the national dish of Laos.
Delicious.
Yes, it's so good. So you can make it with, duck meat, beef, chicken. You can have it raw beef. And depending on what your preference is, that's something you may see in Thai restaurants, but it's actually the national dish of Laos. And so I grew up with that. I actually grew up thinking that pho was Lao because, again, I didn't grow up in an Asian community. And so my parents, particularly my mom, cooked pho. And I grew up thinking pho was Lao. It wasn't until college that I realized, oh, like, Vietnamese people eat pho and they have their own type of pho. And it just goes, again, mind blowing. But again, our food is all fresh. You can't meal prep it. It's a lot of stews, vegetables, badak. is unfiltered fish sauce. That's one of the main ingredients. So it's funky and fresh is how I like to describe it. One of my close friends, he's a Lao food influencer now, and yeah, describes it as funky fresh. And I think that's the most perfect way to describe our foods. We like to invite people to gather together, to eat together, because it tastes better when we're in community
Yeah.
together. So that's one of the things I love about our culture and our people is that people are so giving, so kind, and being able to invite your fellow friend to eat with you just makes the experience so much better and the food tastes so much better.
Absolutely. Now, you grew up in the South in a predominantly white neighborhood. Did you feel tension between your Lao culture at home and the Western culture everywhere else? How did you navigate that as a family?
Yes, so much tension with the white dominant culture, which is, again, a lot of what I talk about today on my platform. My dad, he actually moved us from California to North Carolina, and he was first scoping all these different states in the South and found North Carolina to be quote unquote safest when it came down to where to raise children because in Oakland, there was a lot of gun violence, a lot of drug abuse that was happening. And he was like, oh, this is not a safe place physically to raise my children, but did not realize the level of racism that we would actually face. So I grew up, again, predominantly white community all the way up until I went to college. It really made me question myself, my identity. Why do I look the way I do? Why do I have these eyes? Why do we eat different food? Why are people making fun of my food, saying that it stinks or it smells funky? Something that I love about our culture, my people, and my family particularly, is that my parents just bit their tongue and was like, all right, let's just go to church and build community there. So we went to church and we went to the temple. But my dad was still very grounded in who he was. He was like, yeah, I go to the church, but do I believe in Jesus? No. So that was something that I think I had to reconcile with. But my dad, he never forced us to believe in a particular religion or spirituality, which I appreciate a lot. But I learned from him that it was important to be Lao. In hindsight, it was really hard for my parents to see us also take on quote unquote American values and dress the way we do. Ever since I was young, I like to express myself, being sexy and playing with makeup, things like that, something that my parents weren't privy to per se. So there's a lot of disagreements about that. I remember my dad saying one day at the dinner table, he was like, you need to be 75% Lao and 25% American. And I'm like, how did you even cut that up like a pie? When I think about it, it's funny now, but I think I really had to grapple with how do I hold both identities and experiences with real value to myself and in my parents' eyes to be accepted and validated by them. Over time, ever since I moved to California, I've been in California for about 10 years now. I've had to shed and heal what those percentages mean and really understand how I am as loud and proud as I can be. And I don't need to succumb myself to a percentage, and I could freely just navigate who I am based off of my experiences that I've had. But growing up, it was a huge struggle to be Lao. I have to be like these white girls in order to be accepted. I had Black and brown friends, but there was definitely anti-immigrant, anti-Black sentiment growing up. It was really difficult to navigate as a young person who did not have a Lao mentor, femtor, femtor to be able to guide. It was just us and our parents. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of racial trauma that took place in North Carolina. But again, healing every day and navigating these spaces and helping my community members really put a name to their experiences so that we all collectively heal and learn that there's nothing wrong with who we are. It was just the society that we grew up in that wasn't okay with the other being anything outside of whiteness or whatever the dominant culture is.
It's funny you say that your dad would go to church but doesn't really believe in Jesus because all the Chinese Mauritians are both Buddhist and Catholic. Yeah, they're both Buddhist
They're
and
like,
Catholic.
why pick? Right. That's the thing is we navigate spaces and we take on certain identities because we like this part of Buddhism. We like this part of Christianity.
Yeah. So You've been in LA for about 10 years now. What was that transition like from North Carolina to LA? Was it a culture shock when you moved to LA?
Yes, it was a huge culture shock, and it was really uncomfortable for the first year. I felt like it was an out of body experience. Never been in a community where I'm not the only Asian. And at that time, I didn't build a Lao community yet. So I moved in 2013 to go to grad school. And I remember going to In and Out for the first time with a friend who lived in LA. And that was my first time that I saw a cop that was Asian. And I was mind blown because that it does not exist in the South. So I was so taken aback that I was like, oh my God, what is happening? This is another country. This is another world. It's wild to me. But of course, now I see more people of color in leadership positions and positions of power in LA. And I had to really unlearn a lot of things that I was taught in terms of systems of oppression, white supremacy, and I thought I knew everything when I was in college at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, because I did start a sorority that was focused on promoting more diversity issues, social justice issues, advocating against social injustice, things like that. And I thought I was good. And then I come to LA, and especially in the spaces that I was in, Asian American studies, a lot of Asian Am organizing spaces, I was like, whoa, they're taking it to another notch. And I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was done learning. And then I was, yeah, caught off guard, but it really challenged me to do better. And I actually healed a lot of my childhood wounds, racial trauma when I came to LA. And then I didn't realize that people can be so lovely. And I felt like a different sense of belonging as long as I was open to accepting it. And I think a part of me wasn't ready to let go of my old self, my identity of being the only Asian. I think I took pride in that for a certain time in my life because it gave me some level of validation. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to be anybody in a sea of Asian. When actually, no, this is building solidarity across different API groups. And I'm getting more language and empowerment and being able to heal with other API leaders who are also healing or mental health practitioners. And finally being able to accept that helped me grow and do what I do in the work of Healing Out Loud today. So, in short, it was tough because I had to confront some really harsh truths and poor self image of my old self. But now that I did that, there's like freedom on the other side. Oh, I don't have to live in fear of having to be only recognized for my Lao or Asian identity, that I have a voice beyond that. I have a voice beyond my trauma. And so it's been an incredibly healing journey to have transitioned, and reasons why I stayed here for so long and been with my community members here, because there's a different level of trust, different level of connection that I feel with the people here.
Yeah. It's interesting how our identity is often defined by the way people perceive us. For you, you were the only Asian kid, so that became part of your identity. I've had similar experiences where I had trouble letting go of something that I thought was a core of my identity. And then I realized, no, it's just one of the things I am.
That's the key, is just acknowledging that we exist on a whole entire spectrum of so many different intersectional identities, and that I don't have to be simplified to being Asian or being Lao just because somebody else sees me as their only Asian friend. Even at UNC, I joined a predominantly Latina sorority. And growing up, I was only in predominantly white spaces. And so coming to a community that was mainly Asian faces, I had to confront that I am more than that. And I don't have to be simplified, and I don't need to be. Yeah. Like, it's just like, come on. There's so many other great things about myself.
Yeah. So much of your work is centered around healing. Was your move to LA the point where you realized that you needed to heal?
That's a good question. And no, I think maybe at the time it was just unconscious. I knew I needed to get out of North Carolina though, because at that point, I believe that I outgrew my friends there, my professional journey there. And again, I moved because of the UCLA Asian American Studies program. I thought I actually was going to do a pipeline to PhD by going to get my master's first. And what I initially wanted to do was to do research to inform policy practice on how do we get more Lao Americans into higher ed spaces. Because I experienced so much liberation in higher ed. I got to go places, I got to meet people and network and have all these different opportunities that I didn't have when I was in high school in North Carolina. So for me, it was almost like a safe container to be able to have a community set for me already in LA. But meeting one of my big sis and mentors who was also in the Asian American Studies program and MSW program, she was really the entry point to a lot of the healing that I did for myself and being able to hold space and help me recognize what I went through wasn't okay because I think I was just on autopilot. I wasn't open to confronting difficult emotions. And she was one of the first people, Wanda. She's featured on my podcast. And she's been such an incredible light in my life that really helped me pivot and understand okay, what I went through wasn't okay, and then start all of the feelings and all of the whatever I suppressed. And so just, I think it just organically happened, like by the virtue of the people I met here that was like, wow, we're opening spaces up for all of these new emotions that I'm able to now feel that I don't have to numb or suppress. And then came my period of being angry. I was so angry in grad school and I'm laughing about it now because I'm like, wow, like that was wild. And then I realized, oh, I don't need to be angry as much anymore. Of course, I have a right to be angry about if things don't feel okay for me, but now it's more regulated for me to understand where I could channel that anger. I have to make space for that narrative too, because again, part of the healing journey is being able to feel all of these difficult emotions that I wasn't able to prior to coming to LA.
Yeah. And since then, you have become a licensed therapist. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that experience in terms of why you went into it and how, as a Lao therapist, you approach the healing process.
Yeah. By virtue of the people I met in LA, especially Wanda, man, I thought I was going to just research and form policy practice. I was into programming. I was into like more macro social work, and what that consists of is more community organizing or putting on programs and being able to create a systemic change more so than the one-on-one. But I didn't realize that after gaining these skills and practicing these coping skills on my own when it comes to emotional regulation and addressing different symptoms of distress and trauma, it took me, I believe, 3 years after graduating with my MSW to recognize that there's a lot of power in being able to just finish up and get licensed. And something that I think I wasn't ready to accept because I thought the only pathway was to just do macro work. But there's so many opportunities that come with licensure, and yes, you don't have to have a licensure to do the work that you do in healing. There's so many different ways to practice healing today. You can do, embodied coaching or yoga or meditation or resilience coaching. There's so many other ways to practice the work. But since I was already on that pathway, Wanda reminded me, you're already 85% there. Why don't you just take the next step? So then I worked my ass off and started actually getting my hours in for licensure in 2020 with the onset of COVID. And I was a COVID therapist, a therapist practicing during the onset of the pandemic with a forensic population. And not that I haven't practiced before, but it was almost this, okay, buckle down, Rita. And I haven't seen this in my generation either. And I realized that there's so many people that require this space. And I finally understood what my purpose was, to become this healing practitioner. And it would be a waste if I worked all the way up here and wasn't able to share my talents or my skill set and really hone into the collective healing space through a one-on-one experience. And so the one-on-one informs the collective informs the one-on-one. So I think for me, what my people were waiting for was just someone to just name it. that we need to heal. And so that's where I put all of my experiences, my Asian American studies background, my social work background, all into one mix where my people can see that, oh, it is possible to heal, that we're not just victims of war, or victims of domestic violence or trauma from the war experience of our parents, that we can really take charge of our life, because I was able to demonstrate that for myself. Obviously, I can't do this work if I'm not practicing it for me. And I realized, like I was sharing earlier, about that time period when I was super angry. I was angry at my parents. I was angry at the white people. I was angry about systems of oppression. I was just so angry, and it was uncontained. And until I was able to really hone in, I was like, why am I so angry right now? And I'm tired. I'm kind of tired of being angry all the time. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not my natural state. My natural state is this, is laughing, cutting up, playful, but we need a safe space to be able to do that in as well. And what's safe for me is going to be different to you. Like, after being able to navigate those tough emotions, I realized, okay, what does it look like for me to teach that is the next step. And so getting a license, being able to teach other people, and then create Healing Out Loud, set the parameter and the bar for us to challenge ourselves, to see us beyond just victims in this world, that we can take charge of our lives.
Yeah. One of the terms that we hear a lot is intergenerational trauma. Can you tell us what that means?
How I define it is trauma that hasn't been healed from the prior generation, whether that is intergenerational poverty, whether that is domestic violence, whether that's behaviorally. So if you grew up with a household where your parents were super anxious and controlled your every move, and you as a child internalized that, oh, I don't have agency, and you then can pick up those behaviors in your adult relationships and act people pleasing because you're not sure of yourself. You're not confident in decisions that you're making. So I would say that is a product of intergenerational trauma, lack of confidence, low self esteem, but again, stemming all the way from war trauma. And that's what I witnessed in my own history of my parents navigating poverty, navigating the welfare system to a degree that they had to focus on how to survive. And because they're focused on how to survive, the emotional neglect was there. And we're not blaming them. We're just noticing that, oh, okay, this is just what happened. They did the best that they could. And the emotional connection, the attunement was just not there. And so naturally, as kids, for me, growing up and not being confident in who I am and acting codependent behaviors and having to heal that was really tough, to recognize that I can survive this decision I'm making and I have to be okay with that.
Yeah. What do you advise clients who are suffering from consequences of intergenerational trauma and they wish that the people around them who are inflicting those things on them would go to therapy, but they won't?
It's so easy to blame other people for your misery. And I think as adult children of refugees or immigrants, particularly from this experience, I think there's a lot of liberation in taking personal responsibility. And we're not saying that the perpetrator isn't in the wrong or that our issues are in a vacuum. But for me, my experience of taking charge, of being able to have a healthy space of like, what my parents did had nothing to do with me and my self-worth, and had everything to do with the circumstances they were in. So when I start to have that level of separation and space, I now understand my behaviors are a product of how they treated me. But now as an adult, I take responsibility for my feelings, my actions, my behaviors, and go to therapy. Yeah, for myself. Process what you need to process. It's going to be unique and different for everyone. Everyone's journey is different. But one thing I do want to acknowledge, especially folks who have suffered from intergenerational trauma, is being able to recognize that it's important to be able to welcome a lot of compassion for yourself and to acknowledge, when there is judgment. Where there's judgment, there's probably some level of shame, as if, you're a bad child or, you're a bad person. If we can just recognize those thought process, that's the start of being able to see, oh, actually, that's not true. I'm not saying it's 100% not true, but maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 40%. But if we can just be able to recognize that what we believe happens on a spectrum and that we can acknowledge those thoughts that are coming through, we can then shift it into something that feels a little bit more validating. So I would say start there and acknowledge that, yes, things happen and you don't have to be a victim to what happened to you anymore.
Yeah. If you could heal the whole diaspora, what would that look like?
Let me just say, I'm not God, but I don't like to think of healing as a stopping point. I think it's a continuum. And that's how I like to define it. It's an ongoing process until your very last breath. And just when you think you're healed, then, something else happens. You're like, whoa, I just flashed back into that moment in time when I thought I was over it and I'm not. And so I would say like a diaspora that is healing is one that's coming together, being a community, laughing, being playful, and really being able to storytell, being able to affirm each other and helping each other grow where there's less gossip and more community building, and being able to just recognize each other's strengths and helping build each other up. Yeah, I would say that's what I imagine and hope for my Lao diaspora to continue to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the common themes I've seen on this podcast is a lot of people go to a white therapist and they have a terrible experience. I would love to hear your perspective as a therapist on how Western approaches to therapy might be maybe not suited for Asian culture, or how it might need to be adapted to account for cultural differences. Have you seen that in your work?
Oh, absolutely. I can pull out the example of boundary setting. So, boundary setting is a westernized concept. There's no such thing as boundaries in Asian culture or even Lao culture. I remember when you get mail sent to you and then your parents already have read it and ripped it up, and then they give it to you like, hey, you got mail. I'm like, why is it open? And so I just remember those specific memories as a high schooler when I started getting mail. But I would say, as a clinician, Asian, Lao therapist, something I have to acknowledge for my clients how hard it is to set boundaries, because boundaries can seemingly feel like you're taking something away from somebody. You're withholding resources from, for example, your parents or elders who all they do is want to help and support. And so we have to acknowledge that maybe it's not boundary setting, but maybe it's how do we communicate the love that is still there and still instilling the boundaries of, hey, I want to support you. I want to be here for you. I want to take this call, but right now I'm busy. So I would say that's such a important nuance, as we're talking about nuances, to be able to capture that boundaries can feel rigid in Asian culture, where you either are for me or you're against me. If you don't give me resources and you hate me, and it's not so black and white. So we have to just make sure to be able to name that particular struggle, is that it's hard. And even me, sometimes I still struggle with boundary setting, but having to practice this and teach my clients this is something that we have to just learn, that as people who are in the intersection of Asian cultures, or particularly in my experience, Lao culture, and then American cultural values, there's that clash, and we are just navigating the best that we can, and one doesn't cancel the other out.
Yeah, that's another thing I wanted to touch on, is how our identity and our culture are so intertwined sometimes that it's hard to let go of one without feeling like we lose the others. A lot of Asian cultures have problematic norms, like very rigid gender norms or very sexist norms. This idea that you can't question elders, whether they do something that you disapprove of or not. So how do you approach letting go of these harmful beliefs? I know you talked a little bit about that on your social media, about letting go of the things that don't serve you anymore while still retaining your cultural identity.
That's the thing, is that culture is not rigid. There's so much that we could say that Lao culture is and what it isn't. But I think the main thing is being able to recognize when you're communicating, what is your intention? For example, I was learning from another client about how Christianity is sometimes used as a way to get a particular need met. For example, oh, this person, they're not Christian, so they may not have this set of values of love or whatnot. But again, Christianity, there's like millions and billions of people who are Christian. Same thing here, millions of people who practice Buddhism. And there's just so many ways to see your culture being enacted and to not use that as a way to harm other people. And harm is also very nuanced, right? Because, how one person reads the way that you enact this exchange with them can be very different than the next person. And so for me, being able to stand up for yourself and being able to hold the nuance of I'm a Lao woman. In Buddhist culture, you can't touch the monk's head, but for some reason, men can do that. I'm not saying I have to go and touch the monk's head because it's like sign of disrespect and whatnot, but there's something there. I have to think about how was this even socialized? Who created this? And so what we were taught is actually what was the dominant culture during that time. And if it was men who created it, then of course they're going to have that cultural value of women being less than or women not being able to do this, or even respecting your elders. It's like, how are we using that? And we can respect the wisdom, we can respect the experiences that the elders bring, but also how do we hold accountability of elders to be able to enact a model of healthy well-being, a model of support, a model of taking care of each other. Just because they're elders doesn't mean they haven't committed any harm, right? So we're not seeing these terms just black and white. We're able to say, okay, I hold you in high regard and I hold your wisdom, and you're also human and I'm also human. Yeah. And just because I'm a practitioner and a healer or a mental health person, that doesn't mean that I also don't go through my own struggles. And so I think it's holding this dialectic of both, and there's so many different truths. How we navigate the cultural experiences. Are we using it to gatekeep, or are we using it to actually ensure safety? Like, what are we doing with that information?
Right. One of the topics you mentioned you'd like to touch on is processing grief. What have you learned about grief through your work as a therapist?
Grief is heavy and needs to be processed. And what I learned about grief through my work is it shows up in so many different emotions. Grief can look like shock, it can look like denial, it can look like anger, and it could finally look like acceptance. And what I learned is that there's a sense of loss, and that sense of loss is almost like a loss of your old self and a relationship to not even people. It could be with animals, it could be your relationship to your job, it could be a relationship to a movie character or substance issue in communities. So it can be a very sensitive topic, but it's important that we hold space for it and not just glide over it, because it can be the reason why it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, because there's so much to be shared about the sense of loss and loss of oneself.
Yeah, I think one thing that a lot of people struggle with is knowing what to say when people are going through grief. Do you have any tips on what to say that is helpful instead of hurtful? I think there's a lot of awkwardness when somebody you know is going through grief and you don't know if what you're going to say is going to be helpful or if it's going to just make them feel even worse.
I think it's really uncomfortable just to feel grief in general, especially someone outside of you that's bringing in their grief to your world. It's uncomfortable. So, a lot of times people may go into problem solving or trying to fix or advise the other person on how to move forward when it's not their call, when a person is ready to move forward. So I think what's important is just acknowledge for yourself. Are you in a space, like a mental and emotional space, to hold grief? And if you're not in that mental and emotional space, it's okay to have a healthy boundary, because you may cause more harm than help. And if you are in that space to be able to hold that grief with your friend, your family member, then I would challenge you to be able to just listen. We're not offering any advice. We're not trying to assume what the other person is thinking of. We're just being able to share, like, hey, you know what? That sounds really tough. Share with me what's going on. And would it be helpful for me to affirm you right now? Would it be helpful for me to get you a glass of water or some food right now? Do you want to watch TV together? You just want to be in community together. And so it's really just tapping into the emotion and being able to attune to this other person. So these are like some one-on-one therapeutic skills that I've had to learn too, as somebody who has benefited from somebody holding space and processing grief. So it really boils down to active listening skills.
Great advice. Now, one of the things I want to do in this new season of the podcast is reclaim what it means to be proudly American, or what American values are. So, do you have mixed feelings about being American, or are you proudly American?
I've learned to have mixed feelings about everything.
Fair enough.
100%. I'm like, dang, how do I even feel about being Lao? But then I'm like, you know what? It's fine. I am very loud and proud. And that's one thing people will recognize about me. It's like, Rita, you're just proud. Even like my students, when I worked at UCLA, a lot of them who are based in California, I've never been to the South, but they're like, Rita, I love how you're just proud to be from the South, even with the nuances of it being a racist geographic location and whatnot. And I just love that you're just so proud. And so I think my pride, it comes from not being represented in certain spaces. And so when I'm in LA, I'm like, yeah, I'm from the South. But I think in terms of being American, I am proudly American, but there is that nuance of American capitalism that I'm not. Again, I don't like to take that on. It's uncomfortable, but at the same time, I benefit from being an American. There's a lot of power, but also what do I do with that power? Yeah. What do I do with the stories that I hold with social media platforms and being a part of the diaspora, even in Hollywood? Yes, living in LA, there's access to entertainment and whatnot. So with my American identity, there comes grief. And that grief of, oh my gosh, the Black and brown indigenous people that were murdered in order for this nation state to be built. Yeah. So there's that notion that I do reject, where that's not okay, but at the same time, it's like over years of evolution, how do we still be in touch with the present moment while recognizing that harmful past and that violent past, and be able to recognize that my parents have been able to access resources through this American system. They've been able to access resources. I've been able to benefit off of my brother being in the military. And I have to say that and own it. So I would say that even in North Carolina, because there wasn't a huge Asian population, I never identified with Asian American per se until it came to SoCal. And then I recognized that, oh, I'm not just Lao, I'm Lao American. There's a nuance because Lao people in Laos, they don't say they're Lao American. I have to acknowledge that experience too and be okay with that. And I'm okay with being in the mixed feelings.
Yeah. Can you recall a particular memory of when you felt proudly American?
Yeah, I love that question because it's so funny. I'm like, when did I feel proud? I think I would say when my brother got into the United States Air Force Academy, with what I knew back then, how proud I was to be an American, because that meant access to different opportunities and resources that my family would not have normally gotten. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I actually was going to go to the Air Force Academy. It was either UNC or the Air Force Academy, and I chose UNC because I felt more connected to the campus. And I didn't realize that the Air Force Academy was what my brother and my dad wanted. But I would say when I saw my brother get into the Air Force Academy, it was like a ticket to freedom for our family when it comes to financial access.
Yeah. The phrase American values evokes very different things for very different people. So I would like to know what you consider or would like to consider American values.
American values.
Not what other people think American values are, but what you believe American values should be.
Oh, I think free will. We hear about freedom of speech, but who actually has freedom of speech? I think about like created for white folks, with the whole pilgrimage and whatnot, all the way to that history. One thing I do appreciate coming here, we probably couldn't say the same things that we say here in Laos. There is that level of nuance to highlight that if I were to wear the old monarchy flag, I would probably be persecuted. You cannot do that But here in the United States, people can proudly experience expressing themselves in whatever fashion or form and speak against the president. But again, holding space for people who have negative consequences of speaking up, like people losing their jobs, for example, for holding a different political ideology than their supervisor or management. That still happens. I want to make sure that we highlight. But I would say overall, in the context that we can be able to say what we want to say without having like intense repercussions for that. But again, that's a nuance that I would say it's different per person, but my experience has been pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that's an important nuance to highlight because it's very easy for Americans to feel like we don't have freedom of speech anymore. We don't have these rights anymore. We are losing rights, literally, but like literally losing rights. But there are places where what we can do here is so much more than what is allowed there. And that is a privilege that we have, and we need to use it.
Yeah, and to not abandon that privilege either, because again, it's so easy just to see from your experience than to see somebody who's living in other countries where they're constantly being persecuted for even wearing something different or freedom of speech, having banned social media because a war was happening. Yeah, censorship is definitely an issue that was evolving as an issue over time, but at the same time, it's like just to recognize that things aren't so black and white.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we like to end the interview with a rapid fire section. Questions that are one word or one phrase answers. You don't have to explain, but you can if you want to.
Okay, I'm ready.
What's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
Durian.
Fair enough. What's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
Chicken curry.
A favorite Lao artist of yours?
Oh, one of my close sister friends, Lena V. She has an incredible voice and is an amazing performer. So she mixes a lot of modern, Lao, and then R&B into her mixes. So she's a very amazing artist in the Lao community. I hope that she gets the shine she deserves.
Awesome. And what is your favorite representation of Lao culture you've seen in media?
I am really proud of the Lao food influencers that have promoted the Lao food movement, and they've been able to, again, use food as a catalyst to promoting not only our food, but, our people, and have made our people more recognized as a part of that endeavor.
And finally, what's your favorite mental health or boundary setting hack?
Mental health hack. I love that. I would say more sleep. I just think that as time goes by, you're getting older, that everyone can just use more sleep. So, yeah, get more sleep to improve your mood.
Awesome. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Here are our takeaways for today's episode. Number 1, Laos is the most bombed country per capita, and it was bombed by the US during the secret war on Laos and Cambodia at the same time as the war on Vietnam. Number 2, being able to name previous generations' trauma responses, such as being overly protective or overly frugal, and how they shaped our behavioral patterns, such as a lack of agency or lack of trust, can help us finally heal and stop the cycle of intergenerational trauma. This kind of trauma came up in Season 1, Episode 5, with Oslin, a Hmong American mom who's trying to break that cycle for the sake of her 2 boys. It also showed up in Season 3, Episode 6 with Travis a few weeks ago about how his dad and many in the Vietnamese diaspora share trauma responses that seem out of place to the rest of us, but is very familiar to refugee communities. Number 3, moving from a place where you're the only Asian or the only anything to a place where you're surrounded by your people can be jarring at first. Number 4, in Asian cultures, setting boundaries can sometimes feel rigid. The way to soften these black and white definitions is to learn to communicate our love and desire to please while still also communicating our own needs in the relationship. Number 5, while our culture was shaped by the people who created it and the norms at the time, we in the present have a chance to shape it for our current time. Culture is ever evolving, just like language. Number 6, patriotism is more nuanced than unconditional love for the country. For many, like Rita, Scott, and Kiran in the past few weeks, it comes with pride, joy, but also grief and a feeling of responsibility. Number 7, losing part of our identity is hard, but it can also bring a lot of growth as we expand how we define ourselves. We talked about this quite a bit with Danny Saldo on Season 3, Episode 5. We contain multitudes, and integrating all the facets of our personality is key to finding peace and staying grounded. That episode is fire, by the way. If you haven't checked it out, go check it out. And lastly, it's easy to blame other people or circumstances, but no matter what the situation, we are ultimately responsible for managing our feelings and setting healthy boundaries. That's it for today. Next week, we're talking to June Chua, a Malaysian-born Chinese-Canadian who left an illustrious career as a journalist and award-winning filmmaker in Canada to move to Berlin and start fresh. We'll talk about her magical childhood in rural Alberta, how she got into journalism, how she found self-love through dance, and how drama class really opened up her world. We'll also talk about how she eventually transitioned from journalism into filmmaking, for which she won an award. Speaking of awards, did you know that the Nuances podcast is nominated for a Golden Crane Award? Now, I don't know if we're going to win this award, and awards are great, but you know what's better? What's better is people listening to the podcast. So thank you so much for being here and listening to this podcast. If you have a friend you know will enjoy this podcast, please send it to them. Other free ways you can support the podcast include rating us or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whichever platform you're using. If you're feeling extra generous, there's also ways to financially support the show on nuancespod.com/support. As always, definitions, takeaways, mentioned links are all in the show notes. I have also included additional reading material about the war on Laos, and there's also a virtual library that has been created called Legacies of War. The link for that is in the show notes as well. Today's episode was sponsored by my band 23rd Hour. If you would like to hear more music, you can go to 23rdhour.com, 23rdhr.com. Today's song is called Until the Daylight Comes. For those times when your friend is going through something rough and all you can do is hold their hand and be there for them. I hope you'll enjoy it. Once again, thanks for listening. My name is Lazu, and I hope you'll tune in next week for another nuanced conversation.
Run through your head, worries and troubles you can't forget. You feel fixed in gear and running in place, like wheels are spinning and you're losing the race. The odds are against you, but you don't dare. So self